Pedro Alves, a dedicated firefighter, sees his life turned upside down when he rescues a baby abandoned in a dumpster. Named Isabella, the child is adopted by a loving couple, but grows up with questions about her origins. Years later, Isabella, now a determined young woman, seeks to understand her past and find her biological mother. What seemed like a simple investigation becomes a search for the truth, revealing painful secrets and bringing to light the profound impact of past choices. The city of São Bento do Vale was known for its serenity and rustic charm, with its narrow streets and cobblestone sidewalks that told stories of times gone by. However, its proximity to vast forests and trails covered in dense vegetation also made it a place of unpredictable challenges. It was in this scenario that Pedro Alves found his true calling. Pedro Alves was born and raised in São Bento do Vale. From an early age, he showed an adventurous spirit, exploring every corner of the city and its surroundings. However, there was one fear that always hovered over his explorations: the fear of encountering a jaguar. This concern was not surprising, as reports of sightings of jaguars in nearby forests always kept the local population alert. However, instead of letting fear hold him back, Pedro used it as motivation to better prepare himself and understand the environment around him. The decision to become a firefighter was a natural extension of this desire to protect and serve. Since he was a teenager, he had a deep desire to make a difference. Thus, his passion for adventure and his desire to help others converged when he decided to join the fire department. For Pedro, each rescue was an opportunity to fulfill his greater purpose, facing physical and emotional challenges. Firefighter training was just the beginning. However, his determination and courage quickly set him apart among his peers. His commitment to protecting the community and his ability to handle high-pressure situations earned him respect and admiration. Over time, Pedro became one of the most respected firefighters in São Bento do Vale. Always with a watchful eye and a dedicated heart, he was involved in numerous rescues and emergencies. On a stormy night, when a devastating fire threatened to consume part of the forest, Pedro was on the front lines, coordinating operations and ensuring the safety of residents. His tireless work and courage in extreme situations made him a central figure in the firefighting effort. Amidst the chaos and flames, Pedro found solace in small victories. A house saved here, a family reunited there. He knew that behind every successful operation was a community that felt safe and secure, and that was what motivated him to keep going, even when exhaustion seemed to be the only feeling he had left. Still, São Bento do Vale, with its trails and forests, carried the mystery of what could emerge from the shadows. Pedro Alves was always ready to face the unknown and protect his community, driven by an unshakable desire to make a difference. Sometime later, it was a hot summer afternoon in São Bento do Vale, and the sun shed its golden rays over the peaceful city. The day seemed ordinary, with the inhabitants going about their usual routines, but Pedro's routine was about to change in unexpected and profound ways. Pedro was on duty that day and, as usual, was attentive at the corporation's base, checking that everything was in order and responding to small incidents. The fire truck's radio buzzed with scattered updates, but nothing to indicate anything extraordinary was coming. It was then that, while Pedro and his partner, veteran Rafael Lima, were waiting for the next call, the radio announced an urgent situation. A group of residents had heard crying coming from a specific point and emergency services were called to check. Pedro, always attentive and concerned, knew he needed to investigate the situation immediately. Upon arriving at the designated location, the smell of garbage was strong and the area was full of piled-up bags of waste. Pedro and Rafael began to search the surroundings, and that was when Pedro heard a fragile and desperate sound. He followed the sound and, with his heart racing, found a trash can that looked particularly full. Carefully, Pedro pulled the lid off the can and, to his horror, found a tiny newborn baby, wrapped in a dirty blanket and in a precarious state. The child's cries were a mix of despair and fragility, and the sight of what seemed like such a small and vulnerable life abandoned in such a merciless place cut deeply into Pedro's heart. Rafael looked at him. "This is a disaster, Pedro. Examine her." Pedro, with his voice choked with concern. Rafael approached and immediately realized the gravity of the situation. Without wasting time, Pedro picked up the baby carefully, holding her with shaking hands. The little girl was weak and covered in dirt, and Pedro knew that every second counted. He quickly called an ambulance, providing the exact location and requesting urgent help. While waiting for the ambulance to arrive, Pedro kept the baby cradled in his arms, trying to warm and comfort her. He whispered reassuring words, even though he knew she couldn't understand. The baby looked at him with big, curious eyes, and Pedro felt an instant bond with that life. It was at that moment that he decided to name her Isabella, a name he felt represented new hope. The ambulance arrived quickly and the paramedics began caring for Isabella, wrapping her in clean blankets and ensuring she received the assistance she needed. Pedro watched with a heavy heart as the baby was taken to the hospital. For Pedro, the emotional impact was overwhelming. He stayed there for a while, observing the area around the trash can. Pedro felt a mixture of anger at the cruelty the baby had suffered and a deep sense of responsibility for having been the person who found her. As the days went by, Pedro continued to monitor the condition of Isabella, who was receiving the necessary care at the hospital. The little girl's story spread throughout the city, and the São Bento do Vale community mobilized to support the case. With the help of a community effort, little Isabella was placed in the care of the local adoption system, and that's when Clara and Enrique Martins entered the story. Pedro, who had followed Isabella's progress closely, felt a mixture of relief and sadness when he saw the girl finally adopted. The relief came from the certainty that Isabella was going to a home where she would be loved and well cared for. However, there was a deep sadness in realizing that, after the rescue, his direct connection with the little girl had ended. He knew he could no longer visit her every day or be as present in her life. The situation left him with a feeling of loss, even though he knew that Clara and Enrique's decision was the best for Isabella. As time passed, Isabella grew up in a healthy and welcoming environment. Clara and Enrique dedicated themselves to offering her a full life, full of affection and opportunities. However, even with all the love she received, Isabella couldn't avoid the feeling that something was missing in her life. She often wondered why she was abandoned and who her biological mother was. These questions followed her as she grew up, and the lack of answers made her feel confused. Clara and Enrique, although they understood Isabella's curiosity and pain, chose to support her in her search for answers without putting pressure on her. They encouraged the girl to explore her emotions and seek information. The story of the mystery of his past and the desire to understand his origins became an important part of his personal journey. As she navigated these issues, her adoptive parents remained by her side, offering support and unconditional love. Pedro, on the other hand, followed life occasionally, receiving updates from friends and acquaintances. Although he never gave up hope that she would find peace and happiness, he carried a constant feeling that there was more to do to help the girl he had rescued. In each small achievement of Isabella, Pedro saw a reflection of his own journey and fought with the desire that perhaps one day he could have a new opportunity to enter her life in some way. Even so, with the great impact the case had on him, Pedro decided to leave his position as a firefighter in the city and started working as a park ranger at a nearby state park. The change of city caused Isabella's family to lose contact with him completely. Suddenly, Isabella became a young adult, still carrying curiosity and the desire to understand more about her past. From the moment she was adopted by Clara and Enrique, she had asked countless questions about her origins, but the answers were limited. Although Clara and Enrique had done their best to provide a loving and stable home, Isabella felt that there was an essential part of her story that still needed to be uncovered. Clara and Enrique were aware of the emotional impact that the search for answers had on her. They knew how important it was for Isabella to understand her story and find some form of connection with her past. With this in mind, they decided to help Isabella on her journey. They began by trying to locate Pedro Alves, the man who had rescued Isabella and, consequently, played a significant role in her life. The first action was to contact the São Bento do Vale Fire Department, where they hoped to obtain information about Pedro's whereabouts. They told Isabella's story and her desire to know more about the day she was found. Retired Captain Eduardo Silva, who knew Pedro from his days as a firefighter, was the one who helped them. Eduardo remembered Pedro and knew that he had changed careers, now working as a forest ranger in a state park near São Bento do Vale. With this information, Clara and Enrique were able to obtain Pedro's current contact details. Armed with the necessary information, the couple contacted Pedro by phone and email. They explained the situation and the importance of reuniting Isabella with the man who had been a pivotal point in her life. Pedro, touched by the story and the opportunity to help, agreed to find a time to meet with Clara and Enrique to discuss the matter in more detail. The meeting was scheduled for a day when Pedro was available, in a neutral location close to the park where he worked. Meanwhile, Isabella was anxious and excited at the prospect of finally getting some answers. Although she knew that meeting Pedro would not guarantee all the answers she was looking for, the simple fact that she was closer to understanding her past was significant. Clara and Enrique supported her every step of the way, helping to prepare questions and discussing what she hoped to achieve with this meeting. Planning the meeting involved more than just logistics. It was also a moment of reflection and hope for everyone involved, in order to provide Isabella the best opportunity to understand her origins and, at the same time, offer the necessary emotional support during this delicate process. The expectation was palpable for Isabella, who hoped that this meeting with Pedro could clarify some of the questions that hung over her life. The meeting promised to be a pivotal moment in Isabella's search for answers and possibly an opportunity to rebuild a connection with her past. With the planning completed and the meeting scheduled, the day of the reunion between Pedro and Isabella arrived, and the setting chosen for the occasion was a chalet located close to the state park where Pedro now worked as a forest ranger. The cabin, surrounded by the natural beauty of the forest, offered a serene setting for such a meaningful gathering. Isabella, aged 22, was anxious and excited while Clara and Enrique accompanied her to the chalet. His eyes sparkled with expectation, mixed with a hint of nervousness. The path to the cabin wound through towering trees, offering a spectacular view but also intensifying the feeling that something important was about to happen. When they arrived, Pedro was at the entrance to the chalet waiting with a welcoming smile. The man, with gray hair and a forest ranger's uniform, displayed an air of experience and calm. He reached out for a firm handshake, welcoming Isabella and her adoptive parents warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you," said Pedro, his voice filled with a mixture of emotion and gratitude. Isabella replied with a slightly shaky voice, "Thank you for having me, Pedro. I always wanted to meet the person who saved me." They settled inside the cabin, which had a roaring fireplace and large windows that offered a view of the forest. The atmosphere was welcoming, perfect for an intimate conversation. During the conversation, Isabella expressed her curiosity about the day of the rescue. "What was it like for you to find a baby in that trash can?" he asked, looking directly at Pedro. Pedro took a deep breath before responding. It was a moment I will never forget. I never had children, and the closest I came to being a father was holding you in my arms that day. There was a mixture of fear and a strong sense of responsibility to ensure their safety. Isabella listened attentively, touched by Pedro's words. Knowing this makes me feel deeply grateful. Your courage and compassion changed my life in ways I cannot fully express. Pedro smiled, visibly moved. Watching you grow and prosper has been one of the greatest joys of my life. What I did for you will always have a special place in my heart. The conversation continued for hours, and the meeting brought unexpected clarity to Pedro. He realized that Isabella's rescue not only shaped her life, but also left a lasting mark on his own path. For Isabella, the reunion brought a feeling of closure and understanding, filling in a part of her story that she always wanted to understand. The dialogue between Pedro and Isabella was sincere and revealing, allowing them both to share the impact that day had on their lives. Pedro found himself reflecting on the profound impact of his actions, while Isabella found a sense of closure and connection to her past. The meeting was a moment of reconciliation, highlighting the importance of the actions of a man who, with courage and compassion, altered a young woman's destiny and, in turn, shaped his own path. Near sunset, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with emotion. Isabella, with tears in her eyes, found the courage to express her deepest feelings after the conversation about the rescue and the impact Pedro had on her life. Pedro, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Isabella began with a trembling voice. You gave me a chance to have a better life, and I will never forget what you did for me. But there is something else I need to share with you. Pedro looked at her with an expression of concern and encouragement. What would you like to say, Isabella? Isabella took a deep breath, fighting to hold back the tears. I always wanted to find my biological mother. I would like to understand her, to know what led her to abandon me and, if possible, to forgive her. It is an important part of my healing process. Pedro listened attentively, feeling a heavy conscience. He knew that this question was a deep and personal search for Isabella. I understand how important this is to you, he replied with a tone of regret. In fact, I tried to investigate your mother's identity after the rescue. I searched the maternity wards and records from the time of the abandonment, but unfortunately, Captain Eduardo, who was in command at the time, blocked these investigations. The impact of these words was immediate. Isabella felt a wave of discouragement and frustration. Captain Eduardo? But why would he do that? He asked, his voice choked with disappointment. Pedro shook his head with a sad look. I don't know for sure. I believe he may have decided it was not in the best interests of you or your mother. Perhaps there were concerns about privacy or legal issues that he felt should be respected. I can't say for sure. Isabella felt desolate. The idea of finding his birth mother seemed more distant and unattainable than ever. She had placed hope in this investigation, believing that finding answers would be possible and even a vital step in her own healing process. Now, with this unexpected barrier, the task seemed almost impossible. Clara and Enrique, noticing Isabella's sadness, tried to offer comfort. Isabella, Clara said softly, this news is discouraging, but it doesn't mean you should give up. There may be other ways to look for these answers. Pedro agreed, trying to offer some comfort. The search may be difficult, but it is not lost. There are alternative paths and institutions that may have records or information that have not been accessed before. It may be worth seeking help from a record specialist or an attorney who specializes in adoption matters. Isabella nodded, still processing the revelation. I'll consider it, she said with renewed determination. But the sadness is still visible on my face. Thank you for trying and for being honest with me. That means a lot. Although marked by a disheartening revelation, The meeting also highlighted the depth of Isabella's feelings and courage in facing a painful part of her past. The conversation with Pedro did not bring the answers she expected, but it offered a new perspective on her journey and reinforced the importance of resilience and hope in her quest to understand her origins. Despite the disappointment she felt upon learning that her search for information about her biological mother was blocked, Isabella maintained her fervent desire to find answers. The encounter with Pedro had rekindled his determination, even if the path ahead seemed full of obstacles. Furthermore, Pedro, deeply touched by Isabella's situation and courage, decided that he could not simply leave the issue without a solution. The emotional impact of the conversation led him to make a bold decision. He took a week off from his job as a park ranger, knowing he would face a significant challenge. With this license, Pedro committed to resuming the investigation that had been interrupted years ago. His first action was to revisit the old files he had kept on Isabella's case. Pedro had kept detailed records of the rescue and initial efforts to find information about Isabella's biological mother. He began to examine these documents with a keen eye, looking for any details that might have been previously overlooked. Pedro also made a series of calls to local maternity hospitals. He contacted the care centers where Isabella might have been born, asking about birth records and any information that might be relevant. Pedro explained the situation clearly, detailing the approximate date and circumstances of the abandonment. Additionally, Pedro checked birth records of women who gave birth at approximately the same time as Isabella's abandonment, looking for any coincidences or details that might indicate a connection to Isabella's biological mother. Each document reviewed and each call made was a step towards the goal, even if the answers were yet to come. Meticulous and dedicated, Pedro leafed through stacks of papers with the determination to find a clue that could lead to a breakthrough in the investigation. Conversations with maternity staff and review of records were often frustrating and time-consuming. Even so, Pedro was determined not to give up. He knew that Isabella's search for answers deserved all the effort he could offer. During that week, Pedro also sought help from some contacts he had made over the years, including former colleagues and registry experts. He hoped that these additional efforts might provide insights or information that he himself had not considered. As Pedro delved back into the investigation, Isabella's hope was renewed. The task was monumental, but Pedro's dedication motivated her to continue. The fact that he was doing this for her, after so long, gave her a new perspective on the importance of her quest. Even though completion was still far away, Pedro's effort offered a ray of hope and an inspiring example of how determination and compassion can make a real difference in people's lives. With each day that passed, Pedro continued to explore all the possibilities, determined to do whatever he could to help Isabella find the answers she so desperately wanted. After days of incessant and meticulous work, Pedro Alves was finally starting to feel the weight of exhaustion. However, persistence was about to pay off. On a cold, cloudy morning, while going through a pile of old files, something caught his attention among the papers. He found the name of a woman named Laura Souza, who had given birth almost 6 months before Isabella was abandoned. The temporal coincidence was enough to light a flame of hope in Pedro. He did not hesitate to investigate further. Pedro carefully examined the records associated with Laura Souza's name, looking for additional details that could confirm or refute his theory. The documentation indicated that Laura lived in Vila das Flores, a city close to São Bento do Vale. The fact that Laura could be Isabella's biological mother and still live so close to where she had been raised seemed surreal, but Pedro knew he needed to act with caution and precision. With the discovery in hand, Pedro immediately contacted Clara and Enrique to share the news, and the three met in a cafe. The conversation was a mix of joy and surprise. Began Pedro, his voice filled with contained emotion. Among the files I reviewed, I discovered the name of a woman named Laura Souza. She gave birth almost 6 months ago before Isabella was abandoned. And the most surprising thing is that Laura seems to live in Vila das Flores, an area relatively close to you. Clara and Enrique were surprised by the revelation. Vila das Flores? Clara repeated with incredulity evident in her voice. That's incredibly close. We would never have imagined that Isabella could have grown up so close to her biological mother. Without knowing it, Enrique leaned forward, visibly interested. What do we know about Laura Souza? Is there any information that confirms that she is really Isabella's mother? Pedro paused, searching for the right words. We're not completely sure yet, but the fact that she gave birth at the right time and lives near you is a good starting point. I will continue the investigation and try to verify if Laura is, in fact, Isabella's mother. I'll need a little more time to gather more information and confirm this. Certainly, Clara and Enrique exchanged looks, clearly impacted by the new possibility. You did an incredible job, Pedro, said Clara, her voice full of gratitude. The idea that Isabella could be so close to her biological mother is surprising. We are very grateful for your effort and dedication. I just hope this can bring some clarity to Isabella. Pedro responded, feeling the weight of responsibility. I will do my best to find out more about Laura Souza and confirm if she really is Isabella's mother. I will keep you updated with any new information I find. After the meeting, Clara and Enrique began to reflect on the new information. The idea that Isabella could have grown up so close to her biological mother aroused a series of emotions and questions. There was a sense of hope mixed with the complexity of how this revelation could affect her. In turn, Pedro prepared to deepen his investigation into Laura Souza. He knew the task was still difficult and that he would need to approach the situation with sensitivity and care. The new clue offered a promising glimpse, but confirming its veracity would be crucial to giving Isabella the answers she sought. Determined to move forward, Pedro continued his work in hopes of bringing a little more clarity to Isabella's story. The next day, the first light of the morning found Pedro and Isabella ready to follow the road to Vila das Flores. Anxiety and hope were visible on both their faces as they carried their luggage and left with the sun still rising. Pedro drove his truck, a robust vehicle that coped well with the dirt paths and holes that the trails presented. Even so, the journey to Vila das Flores was more than a physical journey. The narrow, potholed road wound through a stunning but treacherous rural landscape. Recent rains had left the paths muddy, and Pedro's vehicle had to be maneuvered carefully to avoid getting stuck. The journey seemed endless due to the rugged terrain, testing both their patience and determination. Finally, after a few minutes of a difficult road, the truck emerged into a small village made up of rustic cabins spread across a green field. Vila das Flores was a quiet town, with an air of rural simplicity. Pedro and Isabella headed towards the center of the village, where they planned to ask local residents for help to find Laura Souza's house. With the help of some directions and the cordiality of the inhabitants, they managed to locate Laura's residence. The house was a modest cabin with a small front garden and a simple porch. Pedro and Isabella parked the truck and approached the front door. When they knocked, they were answered by a middle-aged woman with a worried expression. His gaze immediately became suspicious upon seeing Isabella, and the attention was palpable. "Good morning," began Pedro, trying to convey a friendly attitude. "My name is Pedro Alves. I am a forest ranger and former firefighter. I'm here with Isabella and we're trying to locate Laura Souza." The woman hesitated for a moment, analyzing Pedro and Isabella with a careful look. "I'm Laura," she said finally, her voice a little shaky. "What do you want, ladies?" asked Laura. "Laura, I understand that this must be a shock," Pedro said, maintaining a soft and respectful tone. I'm the firefighter who rescued Isabella when she was abandoned in São Bento do Vale. Since then, she has sought to understand its origins. We found information that indicates you may be his biological mother. The mention of São Bento do Vale had an immediate impact on Laura. She froze for a moment, and grim recognition crossed her face. São Bento do Vale, she murmured, her eyes widening slightly. I know São Bento do Vale, but why are they looking for me now? Isabella, who had remained silent until then, took courage and took a step forward. I'm the abandoned baby, she said, in a firm but emotional voice. I grew up with Clara and Enrique, my adoptive parents, but I always wanted to understand the reason for my abandonment. I'm here because I want to know more about who you are and why things happen this way. Laura looked at her with a mix of sadness and fear. Please come in, she said finally, with a tone that revealed the need to face the situation, but also the anxiety of dealing with the revelation. Let's talk about this. As they entered, the scene inside their home contrasted with the cold and silent environment outside. The cabin was simply decorated, but the atmosphere was heavy, marked by Lara's anxiety. She was under 40, and a lit cigarette between her fingers seemed like an attempt to stay calm. Lara's troubled look was visible, especially when her eyes met Isabella's. With a hesitant gesture, Lara invited them to sit down. She struggled to maintain her composure, but the tension was palpable. Lara sat on a wooden chair, and Pedro and Isabella took places opposite her on the sofa, waiting for the right moment to continue the conversation. I really didn't expect to receive visitors like this, Lara began, trying to keep her voice steady, but revealing an underlying tremor. Sometime after abandoning the baby, I lived in São Bento do Vale. I tried to forget the painful past and move on, but I had to move away. Pedro, feeling the gravity of the situation, asked a direct question, but carefully. Lara, the reason we're here is because Isabella, who you may know as the baby who was abandoned, wants to understand what happened. Can you tell us what happened that day? The mention of the past seemed to trigger a deep reaction in Lara. Her eyes filled with tears, and she brought her hands to her face, trying to contain the despair that was about to overflow. She began, her voice broken by a sob. I feel enormous guilt. During the pregnancy, my husband, João, became violent and suspicious. He threatened me to have an abortion, but I couldn't do it. João was always difficult to deal with, but during the pregnancy he got worse. He constantly threatened me and became increasingly aggressive. When the baby was born, the situation became unbearable. João stole the baby while I was sleeping. He threatened me not to call the police and told me that if I did, he would kill me. I was terrified and had no strength to fight. When João left, he abandoned the baby in the trash can. João died in a work accident shortly afterwards. I should have felt relief, but the guilt and sadness never left me. I tried to move on, but I could never forgive myself for what happened to my daughter. The silence that followed was heavy as Isabella processed the painful revelations. Lara's story painted a dark and complex picture, and her guilt and pain were evident. Pedro, touched by the intensity of the moment, intervened with a soft and supportive voice. Lara, thank you for sharing your story. I understand this must be very difficult for you. What's important now is finding a way to help Isabella find some closure and peace. Lara, still with her eyes full of tears, replied, I'd like to do whatever it takes to help. I understand that my actions cannot be undone, but I am willing to do what I can to right the wrongs of the past. The impact of Lara's words fell like a weight on Isabella's heart. She was in shock, and what she had just heard felt like emotional torture. Tears began to stream down her face as she struggled to process the gravity of the situation. Emotions were running high, and she couldn't contain the tears that accompanied Lara's lament. Lara, her face still marked by crying, looked at Isabella with a mixture of disbelief and relief. She seemed astonished to see her daughter alive and healthy after all these years of suffering and regret. The shock and guilt in Lara's eyes contrasted sharply with the image of Isabella, now a strong and resilient young woman. Isabella slowly got up and approached Lara with her eyes full of compassion that she herself was trying to understand. "Lara," she said in a soft but firm voice, "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. I understand now how hard it must have been for you. And through it all, I want you to know that I survived and I'm here to meet you." Isabella's words were a relief from the pain that Lara was carrying. The young woman, even after being abandoned, was there to offer forgiveness, which seemed almost surreal to Lara. "I never thought I would ever hear that," Lara replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never imagined that you could forgive me and see you healthy and alive. It's something I never thought would happen." Isabella continued, her voice mixing pain with a sincere desire for reconciliation. "I know you did what you could to deal with an impossible situation. Life hasn't been easy for me, but it's also brought me here, and I'm willing to try to understand what happened and move on. I'm not here to judge, but to find peace." The meeting brought an intense mix of emotions for everyone involved. Isabella and Lara were facing a torrent of contradictory feelings, but there was a growing sense of relief and hope in the air. The painful story of abandonment and suffering was being addressed head-on, and for the first time, it felt like the wounds were beginning to heal. Furthermore, Pedro realized that, despite the difficulties and emotional weight involved, he had fulfilled an important part of his purpose. He helped resolve a painful chapter in Isabella's life and provided an opportunity for new understanding between mother and daughter. The fulfillment and satisfaction Pedro felt was profound, knowing that his dedication had allowed for a moment of reconciliation and healing. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere in the cabin was filled with a new kind of hope, and Pedro felt that, despite the scars of the past, there was now a real chance to build a more peaceful and understanding future for Isabella and Lara. Isabella's reunion with her mother, Lara, brought profound emotional relief and a sense of closure for everyone involved. Isabella, upon hearing her mother's painful and harrowing story, realized that abandonment had not been an act of cruelty, but rather a result of desperate and tragic circumstances. This realization helped ease the pain she had carried for so many years. Lara's revelation about her life and struggles, combined with the forgiveness offered by Isabella, transformed a dark chapter into a space of healing and understanding. In turn, Lara had the opportunity to face her demons and express her regret. Seeing Isabella alive and healthy was an emotional shock for her and a moment of encounter with the reality of her past choices. The chance to apologize and hear her daughter's forgiveness brought a mixture of relief and sadness, but also a feeling of liberation. Facing the pain and guilt that had accompanied her for years was a crucial step for Lara, who could now begin to deal with her feelings in a more constructive way. The fact that Isabella was able to forgive Lara allowed them both to reconnect, bringing a powerful and necessary resolution to their lives. Isabella's forgiveness not only closed an old wound, but also opened the door to a new beginning, allowing both women to begin a process of reconstruction and mutual understanding. For Isabella, it was a chance to leave suffering behind and approach a new form of connection with her mother. Watching the outcome of this emotional journey, Pedro felt a profound impact. The sense of accomplishment was clear and significant. He had devoted weeks to the investigation, facing challenges and navigating a sea of documentation and records. Reflecting on what he had achieved, Pedro realized that his work had not only unraveled a complicated mystery, but also brought relief and reconciliation to two deeply affected lives. The purpose Peter felt was the most rewarding reward. He had accomplished an important mission and made a difference in the lives of the people involved. The journey of rescue and investigation, which began with a search for answers and an attempt to solve a painful case, had turned into an experience of great emotional impact. Pedro knew that, in the end, His dedication helped transform a story of suffering into a story of healing and reconciliation. As he left the hut, Pedro reflected on the importance of his mission. The rescue and investigation work not only brought relief to Isabella and Lara, but also offered him a sense of personal fulfillment. The opportunity to help resolve such a complicated and emotional chapter in their lives brought a sense of completeness and purpose that Pedro would carry with him for a long time. In his heart, he felt he had made a difference, not just as a professional, but as a human being committed to the well-being of others.